So tonight at the Active Travel Café, we'll start with our usual crowdsourced news update. So if you've got anything to share, anything that's happening near you, or anything that you think that's happening nationally that you think we should be talking about, or even internationally, you're welcome to stick a hand up. Following that, I am delighted to say that our speakers tonight are Mark Strong from Transport Initiatives and Ben Coleman from Urban Movement, and they are going to talk about LCWIPs. And I think we've had a few requests over the last few years actually to have something on LCWIPs. And I hadn't realised this, nearly 10 years of LCWIPs. For those who don't know what an LCWIP is, I will going to leave it to Mark and Ben to tell us more about them when we get to that point. But before we start on that, does anybody have anything that they would like to share? Any news? Oh, Tim, do you want to come in? And he's muted himself.
Hello.
Hi, Tim.
Nice to see you, Sally. Welcome back. Just to say that the Walk Wheel Cycle Trust has released its biannual cycling index, walking, wheeling, and cycling index, and I'm in the Leicester report. There are two photos of me in the Leicester report, so I'll put the link in the chat so you can all download it and look at me. Okay, thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tim. Ruth?
Well, as there doesn't seem to be much news, I just thought I'd say something. Cycling UK, no idea what they're called these days, have just shot an own goal with their Safe Cycling for Women, with a photograph of a super sporty woman with a helmet, with a drop-handled road bike, dressed in lycra, as their photo picture for why women aren't cycling or some kind of stuff. We really, really, really have to get this image right everywhere on every format because it's just so irritating. And yes, we can write in and complain, and yes, we can, ask them to do better. But surely by this stage, it's time for them to have looked at it and realised that it's completely wrong. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Roxanne?
Hi. Hi everyone. Well, Sally suggested I should come and share my news. I've got news. It's personal, but somewhat relevant. I'm leaving England and the UK. I know, I'm gonna be sad. It's official. I am actually going all the way home, all the way back to Perth in Western Australia. And I am leaving hopefully in about 3 weeks' time to go and do some travel in Europe, and I will be in Perth by August, so leaving the Northern Hemisphere in July. I have an exciting job, but I can't tell you about it yet. So I'll have to come back and report.
You have to get up very early in the morning or very late at
Can I
night,
do
is
a
what the time difference
pre-recorded
is.
session? I mean, trying to do interviews and things with Perth has been interesting. But I might be cheeky and pop a few little links in the chat so you can see some of the infrastructure that I am just so excited about. I can say I've already got my first official site visit booked in as well. So it's all starting, and I'm actually really proud of my hometown. It's doing some really good stuff. When I realized that my cycle commute to work is going to be 25 minutes on pristine Dutch level separated cycleway without even having to go on a road or deal with a junction almost door to door. Yeah, So part of my preparation though is I've had to update my wardrobe, my bike wardrobe, because I need different bikes. So I've now acquired a Brompton, and I'm researching hardtails for all those off-road trails that I'm really excited about. But I've got to take my Dutch bike with me. So anyway, I've dropped some teasers there. It's really emotional and hard, and I think you all know how much this community means to me. But it's been a bit of a a time coming, and it's time to go home. I expect, though, now that I've bragged all about it and shown it off, and I'll be sharing all these things about how great it is, I'm probably going to have a long line of visitors. So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
anyway.
Cambridge's loss is definitely Perth's gain. And now I'm going to really embarrass you, Roxanne,
Oh
by
no.
just saying, I think, and probably, I'm sure on behalf of everyone here, how much we're going to miss you, but also how much you've contributed to this community over such a long time. And I think the first time I met you was in relation to a women in cycling event, which was, well, over 10 years ago now, I think. Probably, yeah, I don't know how much over, as I do remember us having to carry our bikes up the stairs to the bike storage in the TfL offices. Um, and I think you have, you've chaired a local, you've ran a local cycle campaign in Cambridge, but you've had massive impact nationally, and you've made such a massive contribution to the Active Travel Cafe as well. And we're really going to miss you. But I'm very excited to see what you go on to do in Australia, and you have to
Yeah,
keep in touch. Um,
absolutely. I shall be the Australian correspondent, uh,
yes.
as I have been the correspondent at various conferences and things. I'm sure I'll find a way to, if it has to be pre-recorded, so be it. But I'll make sure there's some updates.
That would be amazing.
Absolutely. And I promise to get better at going back on Blue Sky and things like that as well, so I can share news.
Brilliant. So on that rather sad note,
Yeah, it's exciting.
it's exciting. It is exciting. Oh, it's very exciting. Yes.
Mm.
Right. I'm going to bring H in and then Mark, and then we're going to move on to our speakers.
Yeah, well, nice news from Roxanne. I wonder whether Colin Graham's still busy in Perth. If anybody remembers back to Colin Graham, he was CTC's rights officer back when, must have been about 1980s, and then went out to Oz. Uh, Wanted to catch up with Tim about Leicester's active travel thing on buses, with the free city centre buses and such like, and how that's taking off. And getting bikes on the outer buses. And this then goes on to one of my little hobby horses, is why are women featured so heavily in RTCs, particularly with trucks? It came up 20 years ago in the Oxfam study, whereby women were featured very much more heavily in rear end type crashes. And it was due to the fact that women didn't seem to have the same powers of rear observation as men did. Now, whether that's the riding style of men, nobody could quite fathom it out. But if we're going to fathom out that could be quite important. And
Or is
bikes,
it to do with the truck drivers?
well, 80% of
No,
fatal.
don't answer that. Don't answer that.
Yeah, but if people are rammed from the rear, and everybody tells you not to go up the inside, but 80% of the fatalities, people are rammed from behind.
Yeah.
And why does it feature women more? I don't know.
Thank you, H. Mark.
Thanks. Slightly abusing my position as a speaker to have a news item, but I did want to actually just comment on that, which is I did my master's thesis on gender differences in spatial rotation. So, and there is a difference, but it's quite likely to be learned. So it's all to do with schooling, not to do with genetics. So but we can talk about that some other time. The news I wanted to put out is that last week had unfortunately simultaneously the Como UK Shared Mobility Conference and the Walking Summit in Liverpool. So I went to the Shared Mobility one. I don't know, presumably some of you went to the Walking Summit in Liverpool. And there was some really useful stuff. The slides are available, and I won't go into it now, but it'd be maybe good to get somebody from Como to talk about it at some point. Some really interesting stuff happening in Camden. And that's the news from last week.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mark. And I've just got a sort of final bit of news before we go into the speakers. I think some of you might already know that Playing Out, the CIC that kind of founded the Play Streets movement, in Britain are kind of finishing up this week. I think today is their last day. But kind of one of their final outputs is a report that Alice Ferguson has written with Tim Gill. And it's called Streets for Play, Streets for Freedom, How a Child Lens Would Transform Transport Policy. And I'll put that in the chat in case anybody hasn't seen it. But I think if, please share widely would be the message from Alice and Tim. Right, and on that note, I am going to welcome Mark again and Ben Coleman, who are going to talk to us tonight about LCWIPs. Who is going to go first?
It's
Mark?
me, so just let me get
Okay.
the right
you want to
slide up
share?
because I've got too many screens open. Right.
Please do put
Can you
questions in the chat as we go.
Yeah, and I won't be normally I read the chat, but I won't be reading the chat. So if you
Or in the Q&A rather.
yeah, but if you, Sally, will filter things onto us, that will be good.
Right, off you go.
Yeah, so LCWIPs, and I wanted Tim actually put this in the chat. So where is he, Tim? You stole my joke. They are called LCWIPs, acronyms. There was a minister at the time who I think was Robert Goodwill, if my memory doesn't do me a disservice, who was the minister. He didn't like that phrase because he said, literally, as Tim joked, he thought it sounded of Elsie and her whip, whatever he was thinking about as a backbencher or as a Tory junior minister, I don't know. And he told all the civil servants that they had to be called LSWIPs. And he insisted on that as the minister at the time. So if you hear some people calling them LSWIPs, that's because that was the official DfT pronunciation at the time. And it should have gone, but some people still call it that. So there you go. That's the gossip from back then. Now, Ben and I were trying to come up with acronyms, and if you want to come up with your own acronyms for LCWIPs, that's mine, which is the boring one. I came up with some real scurrilous and scatological ones, which you probably couldn't use here. But lots of carefully worked out imaginative proposals. I'm sure you can come up with better ones. So what are they? Well, here's some questions before, really. What does local mean? Is it a town, a city, national park? They have LCWIPs. Regions. Cycling, what sort? Ruth just said about the wrong sort of pictures of cycling. What sort of cycling do we mean when we talk about cycling? Walking, well, it was done in 2017, so written in 2016. People weren't thinking as much about inclusivity then as they are now, so wheeling wasn't mentioned. Infrastructure is important. It is about stuff. It's not about how many officers you've got, about cycling strategies, about budgets. It's about stuff. Same thing, by the way, goes if you're working on planning and you have community infrastructure levy. That's the infrastructure there is things. And finally, it's about a plan. So it's about a list of things that you might do, not about the actions you might do to get those done or the processes or so on. So it's a very focused document and should really be focused on it. So this is the original slide at the time from 2017, and this is what was intended. And I think we've got to look back to 10 years ago and think about what did people want from LCWIPs when they did it. And it says, it's intended preparing LCWIPs will assist local authorities. And of course, some of this predates combined authorities, it predates some unitaries, it predates a lot of councils that are there. So remember the councils that existed in the situation that existed at the time to identify cycling and walking, as we said, not wheeling, infrastructure investments, in future investment in the short, medium and long term. And short consideration is given to cycling and walking within local planning. And that's we'll talk about that, or Ben will talk about that, making the case for future funding. So I think that probably has helped with the with Active Travel England. It helped shape what Active Travel England did. And they had lots of nice little graphics in there. And essentially, there were three things that LCWIPs were supposed to produce. A network plan for walking and cycling. So this schematic. So core zones, routes, it didn't really define what they were. It just said this is a network plan, a prioritized program. And all of these words, all of these terms that we used in there were all done with the best intentions, but they were all open to misinterpretation. And if you find, you can find any council that has interpreted this in a different way. So all the things, what is prioritization? Who does it? I'll mention that later. And finally, a report. And it didn't say the style of the report. Some reports, some LCWIPs are 300-400 pages long. Other are 10, 15, 10 pages long, but all LCWIPs. So there was a guide document, but there wasn't really a guide to the guide. And the idea was to avoid this. This is a route in East Sussex, but it just peters out in the middle of nowhere and just as finish off. And we've all can throw in our own examples of this sort of thing. It had a complicated process. So going back to that one, it had a simple aim and a complicated process with these 6 stages of scope, gathering information, network planning for cycling, network planning for walking. Note, they were 2 separate stages. Prioritize improvements and integration and application. I'm not going to go through all the different infographics in here, but it set it all out. It was quite nicely set out, but not everyone read everything in there. And the key thing is that this one here, short, medium, and long, the idea was that it was supposed to be a 5-year program and you renewed it every 5 years. So if you go back to the original document, it's still relevant, but it sets out these ideas. So network planning for cycling, and I'll just talk about that a bit more, is about clustering, using GIS, using the propensity of cycling tool, which is now way out of date because it's based on the 2011 census, using all the tools that existed at the time, which have been way superseded by Active Travel England tools, to come up with a cycling network plan. So here is one I prepared earlier. We're revising this one at the moment, Ben and I. But this just happens to be one that we know because we're working on it, and it's Crawley. So they had their own, West Sussex had their own term consultants come out with this spider network of all the things where you might possibly want to go from and to in Crawley. We then drew straight lines on them to show these are the straight lines where you might want to go to and from in Crawley. No, you wouldn't want to cycle straight across the main runway at Gatwick, but the straight line crosses the runways. We then turned them into a sort of slightly more direct, but still straight line ones that went between those points, avoiding the runway. And then we turned them into actual lines. The yellow lines are the straight lines, and the coloured lines are the actual routes that get superimposed on tops of highways. And then we come up with proposals. So that's the cycling side of things. The walking side of things was in a completely different chapter, different section, and it was this idea of core walking zones. So we only focused on walking within 400 meters. And this is another one we worked on, also Ben and I actually, in his previous job in Chichester. So 400 meters, if you know Chichester, it's a small city, technically, but within the walls, it's very small. So looking at walking, it's really only that core section in the center of the town, center of the city, that you do the walking network from, and you use this walking rule audit tool. And really, there hasn't been an update. We've come up with a terrible acronym. We've enhanced the walking rule tool, and it's an URAT tool, which is, if you can come up with a better one, that'd be fine. But it really just looks at this core network. So walking is something that is happening, and in fact, there was stuff talked about the future of walking in LCWIPs or network plans last week at the Walking Summit. It then moves on to prioritizing improvements. And what it said was each local authority can develop, as long as you prioritize, every local authority can use its own metrics for prioritization. So one might be political delivery, another one might be cost, one might be safety or personal safety, women in the dark at night, or it might be connecting the new developments in their area. The DFT didn't say what you should use as long as you did your own prioritization. So one council's top priority, if it had been moved to a different council, might not be that area's top priority. Just says it's a bit like the arguments about what colour you should paint your cycle tracks. As long as you're consistent within your own council, that's fine, but you don't have to be consistent with anyone else. So there is an issue with the prioritizing ones. On the other hand, I suppose it doesn't really matter because it's your council deciding what to prioritize in your area, not anyone else. And the final one is the integration and application. So just to say some of these things about prioritization, these are some of the things that could be used, but they didn't take into account opportunities. Something happens, it's a 5-year plan, suddenly a development happens, or somebody wants to throw money at something and it's not in the route. What do you do with it? What do you do with overlaps with other plans? Politics. And a possibly misattributed quote, I've heard it, I think Eisenhower as well, no campaign plan survives first contact with the enemy. An LCWIP is a plan, you put it in the real world, and suddenly the real world starts things hitting it. What do you do next? So just finally, some issues that I've found. It doesn't really talk about placemaking. So what is an area nice to go through? It's all about routes and infrastructure. Certainly, as I said, doesn't talk about accessibility, doesn't talk about very small interventions that can unlock lots of stuff, but it's not part of a bigger whole. So it does focus on the longer routes, which by and large tend to be commuting. And there isn't the final circle of have you actually built what you said you were going to build 5 years ago? So the very first ones that were done in 2017, has anyone gone back to those areas and said, hey, when we said we'd build this in 2018, there were 46 original pilots. Have they worked? And for all we know, ATE are doing this, but Ben knows a bit more about what ATE were thinking of doing. So over to Ben. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everyone. I'm replacing you, aren't I, Mark?
Yep.
Okay. Is that coming up all right? Cool. Okay. So I think Mark and sorry, just to say, I'm Ben. I'm head of Active Travel at Movement. Mark and I, we're working on the Crawley LCWIP together at the moment, and we were speaking with Sally a few months ago, and thought it'd be a good idea to talk about our collective LCWIP experiences. So my part of the presentation is talking mainly about a few themes, kind of points that I guess we've kind of come across for better or worse across LCWIPs. And I guess this is our experience of them, so not necessarily universal. But yeah, it'd be interesting to know actually probably if others have had the same that we've encountered. I think as a starting point, I started my career at Brighton and Hove Council, and at the time, this was pre-LCWIP. I'd have loved an LCWIP as an officer at the time. Brighton and Hove at that point was a really good place to work. It was a Green majority council. The politics were all really good in terms of, like aligned with what we were trying to do as officers. But probably the missing piece was the strategy element. There wasn't actually there was a political strategy, but not necessarily one for officers. And I think what that meant in reality was these are schemes on the screen that will actually either been consulted on or designed at the same time for really high quality projects. Not much kind of narrative between them. And I remember that, that was something that came up quite a lot of public engagement. It's like, well, is this scheme talking to that one? Or what if this one changes that? If we'd had an LCWIP, it would have helped a lot at that time. So I think, like Mark was saying, I guess in that context, the LCWIPs are invaluable because they are so important as a tool to bring lots of ideas together, maybe not all of them. And actually that's something I'll get onto shortly. One thing just to point out, and Mark alluded to it, is a lot of the things I'm mentioning are points that I raised. There was an LCWIP refresh kind of consultant team up until a couple of years ago, where ATE, DFT, and I think unfortunately it was a bit of a victim of ATE's kind of infancy. And if Brian Deegan were here, I'm sure he'd be saying otherwise. But the LCWIP refresh was something that had real momentum, looking at the existing tools and the method, looking at what elements were working well, what were working less well, and without completely redefining the methodology, is looking at what could be refreshed. So lots of the points I'm going to mention are kind of in the spirit of that and not that dissimilar. The last time I spoke to Brian, there was the LCWIP refresh was not actually going to be such a headline thing in its own right anymore. It was going to be absorbed within another update. I'm not sure if it was the rural design guide, but it was something else. But nonetheless, kind of what I'm talking about is not necessarily new in that sense. One of the big things in that LCWIP refresh, and something that I was really kind of keen for, was effectively like equivalent of like a stage 0, something that was a bit more open-ended and probably not so definitive in terms of having like an active travel focus, something that was a bit more potentially like therapeutic, just placing the LCWIP and understanding it in the context of the location you're working, what officers and members trying to get out of that LCWIP, and also just aligning it with other work streams. Like Mark said, the LCWIPs aren't necessarily happening in isolation, and so it's important to know, well, what else could it dovetail with? Are there any obvious conflicts? And particularly on the point of scale and design scale of ambition as well, I guess, because when LCWIP started, LTN 20 wasn't there, but is now. And actually that was a particular thinking about there's a particular LCWIP I worked on with one authority who were satisfied with their whole network being shared use footways everywhere. And when LCWIPs first started, there wasn't necessarily that oomph to kind of like basically, I think in the end, I kind of went and dobbed that authority into Adrian Lord at the time to kind of like try and get help, because we didn't have an authority that couldn't get beyond the design ambition point, and the lack of that stage zero really, that that would have given us that kind of stage to have those kind of discussions. And actually, the example on the screen is an interesting one I've chosen from. I worked on the Harlow LCWIP a few years ago, and it's an interesting example where Harlow has actually delivered a lot of its LCWIP proposals, albeit the kind of the softer context and the public realm within which those have been delivered is still quite lonely. This is one of the upgraded routes, one of the key routes in the LCWIP, which is isolated. The lighting's not great, quite municipal in terms of its design, but also it lacks surveillance and it did the active travel brief, but didn't necessarily go further in terms of streetscape and wider integration. And on that point, I guess for going from stage 0 into stage 1, determining scope of the LCWIP is all about scale. And again, I think a key thing from my experience has been walking and cycling is obviously in the name, but in my mind, there's a tendency for cycling to probably get more attention in terms of like the analysis, but also the outputs of the LCWIPs. And I think that that's something I'll come back to in a bit, but I think something that would help with that stage 0, but also in stage 1 is actually being a bit more interrogating what is meant by local is in the LCWIP name, actually interrogating LCWIPs a bit more in terms of what scale are they working at? Because I think that would really help harness what the tools are there for. One of the big things in the LCWIP refresh was, I think it won't be news to anyone, that like the outputs of the cycling tool RST and the walking tool RAT are imbalanced. They're not really comparable. They have different inputs. They have different outputs. They can't be measured in the same way. And it is a bit jarring when you're trying to present the results of an LCWIP and you're not really comparing like for like in terms of how you've justified your measures. And it's my point being that the determining scope is such an important step that is often kind of just overlooked and assumed it's just like the local authority's red line boundary. But actually that is a real important step of actually getting the best out of the tools and the methodology. And the example I've included on screen actually is and Robin will be familiar with this, in my last job at PGA, we put together the Strategic Active Travel Network for Oxfordshire, which was derived a lot from the LCWIP. And in my mind, it worked quite well, actually. And it kind of shows that actually the LCWIP tools at that scale worked really well at a strategic kind of county scale. But I actually find, and I'll kind of get onto this now, is that it's at the smaller scale where it tends to struggle more. And I think this is one of the things with the language of the LCWIP, and potentially from the tools as well, is that my experience of them has been is that people are generally more articulate in their experience of cycling issues and their cycling ambitions, rather than potentially like their everyday impediments to walking and wheeling, and actually how they just get about in kind of like quite an everyday modest way. I think the reason that and this is just an inherent imbalance in the methodology, is that it does rely on this route-based approach, where for cycling at a longer distance, that might make sense because you are more likely to select a route based on some qualities. Walking to an extent and wheeling, obviously you will, but you're probably more flexible and you've probably got a higher density network to rely on. But the routes, I found it quite jarring. The past core walking zone and the thought of walking routes doesn't always translate very well. And I think that also then the issue with that being is then that manifests itself in the LCWIP, where the cycling schemes are potentially easier to conceptualize. Ironically, it might be easier for someone to conceptualize 5 miles of a protected cycle track over a series of more modest interventions. On that point, on the screen is examples from Faversham. I think Adrian Berendt's on the call. This is something that Adrian and I worked on together, where we worked on Faversham's LCWIP, which also kind of was at the same time as it becoming a 20-mile-an-hour town, and alongside its neighbourhood plan. And what's been really, I think it's a brilliant scheme what Faversham have done, in that rather than being completely stuck to the LCWIP methodology, I think the whole LCWIP had about one cycling recommendation or explicit cycling measure. It was very much about walking and connectivity. And I guess a measure of its success is Faversham, which is a relatively small town in North Kent, secured 1.5 million from Active Travel England to develop its crosstown walking route. So which is what's on the screen here. So it's a series of small junction crossing improvements, but it spans the whole width of the town. So you've kind of got a level surface, a fully inclusive route for the full width of the town. And now the town are also pursuing the equivalent north-south route. And in my mind, for the Favershams of the world of that scale, that is where the determining the scope is so important to help get you the right kind of measures. On that point, and something that Faversham was incredibly collaborative with the town council there. It had a really strong working group, which helped kind of keep us on our toes as kind of as the consultant team. But it isn't something that happens necessarily that often in LCWIPs. I think you kind of invariably get people are very quick to get into that data and mapping. My experience is that people like seeing maps and they like seeing their everyday kind of experience put onto a plan and they respond to that. But it doesn't necessarily go further in terms of again, like if it was any other kind of project, you'd be open. If I think about design projects that we're working on at the moment in urban movement, our design projects are open to incredible kind of scrutiny relative to what LCWIPs get. And yet it's LCWIPs that are setting a 5-10 year plan for active travel for a whole settlement. But the methodology doesn't necessarily lend itself to giving that. It doesn't give that space in my mind to much engagement. This tends to be a dominance on data, it's led by data, not so much on engagement. On that point, this is a screenshot from an LCWIP I managed in Oxfordshire, which was Wantage and Groves. We had a really good working group on that project, and what Oxfordshire managed very well was as part of the working group, we created a felt plan, and we just asked for all like the good, the bad, and the ugly of not just active travel, but everyday experiences in Wantage and Grove, and the heat map kind of reflects that. I'll come back to Wantage in a minute, but what was really good about it is that this was a resource for the county that didn't necessarily need to be used solely for the LCWIP and active travel. It was a therapeutic opportunity, I guess, quite cathartic for members in the working group to get their points out there. But again, it wasn't purely active travel. It was slightly beyond. It was akin to kind of like stage 0, and we did do this quite early on in the process. I think that's also quite an important point then in terms of, and this will come on to the next point about governance, but authorities knowing what to do next with LCWIPs. There's a lot that I've seen that I think people are generally quite happy to do LCWIPs, or most authorities are, but they don't always know what to do with them next. Sometimes it is lip service to doing the project or doing the report itself, and it doesn't go much further. But I think the best or most effective LCWIPs I've seen have been the ones where there's already been at that stage 6 in the LCWIP, which is often kind of for most people just finishing the report, is actually that's where you're doing the groundwork of what's going to come next, what could this project align with. And so in Wantage, on that previous slide, this hotspot here is the historic market square in Wantage, where several of the LCWIP routes converged. Oxfordshire already had one eye on the next step, and so now Movement are working with Oxfordshire on the Market Square scheme, where general traffic is hopefully going to be rerouted away from the Market Square. Buses are going to be better integrated. It is going to be a genuine market square, and whilst it might not be explicitly active travel, the kind of design tone that sets for a relatively small town is incredibly important. And just on that point, and actually Mark made it earlier, the point about refreshing as well, and that the spirit that LCWIPs are supposed to be live and kind of like documents that are kept up to date. It's just something I think that's probably overlooked in the original guidance, that it assumes offers a time and resource that often isn't there to actually take the time to do that. There are a few authorities I know of, Harlow, Brighton, Gravesham, to name a few, that have or are refreshing their LCWIP. But that can be quite a significant undertaking. But it is a bit of a shame in terms of governance and sometimes making sure, particularly where, like Crawley, like Mark mentioned, where there's a lot of development going on and us knowing what to do with all that development. So governance, I guess this probably isn't a surprise, not unique to LCWIPs, but those ones I've talked about where have been most effective with kind of maintaining the momentum of the LCWIP have either been those authorities where it's been a county, like an Oxfordshire or an Essex, as a county-wide prioritisation tool, or a Brighton, where it's unitary, and they can kind of they've got like a plan, a pipeline of schemes, which is what the LCWIP was really setting out to do. Faversham was the other extreme, where you had the 20s Plenty campaign and the town council really banging the drum there, but still got a really good end result. In my view, the LCWIPs that struggled are probably those a bit in the middle, where the governance isn't as clear between a district and a borough maybe, and a county, and who's responsible for what can be a bit of a barrier. But like I said, that's not unique to LCWIPs. And lastly, and this is just, I guess, a slightly odd one in that the whole presentation, I guess, is on about LCWIPs, but also recognizing sometimes that there might not always be the right project at the right time. And actually, this is an example of Farnham in Surrey, which is a project I was working on a few years ago, where we were developing the public realm and movement strategy for Farnham, which is a really pretty historic market town, but dominated by its one-way loop, completely dominated by loads of traffic, narrow footways, nothing for cycling. But there was a real push at the time locally to get an LCWIP done. And so myself and like the guys from Surrey, had to kind of like really resist that actually. And kind of my point was that the LCWIP should be in the slipstream of the public realm and movement project in the town centre, not, you could almost accelerate an LCWIP, but it wouldn't be landing at the right time. And what's kind of like now transpiring quite nicely in Farnham. So it's on site at the moment. And I was there just before Christmas. This is a photo of some of the work that's on site at the moment. But this is setting a design tone for all of Farnham now that in a way makes the LCWIP much easier to deliver because it's in this context rather than what was there before. And just for a bit of context, the loading pad on the left-hand side there, the back of it, i.e. the left-hand side of it, that is where the old curb line used to be. So Farnham is effectively halving its carriageway capacity in its old town, repurposing it as footway, outdoor seating, greening, and whilst again not explicitly an active travel scheme, will make the LCWIPs delivery much easier once you've kind of got this in situ in the town centre. And yeah, that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks to both of you. Two really, really super presentations. Just very quickly before we go into the Q&A, I've seen that some people can't work out where the Q&A is. If you can't see it, if you go to the bottom of the screen and click on more, you should be able to find the Q&A there. If you're really struggling and you want to put it in the chat, I'm sure Robin or Wilf will help me fish out questions from there. But yeah, I mean, I'm going to start with the first question. I think when I remember when LCWIPs were first launched and being involved in the development of Newcastle's LCWIP, and how the emphasis at that point was more on, I think, local engagement than perhaps it is now. And I suppose it would be really interesting to know what you thought about how that should be incorporated, how local, because there's such a big emphasis on consultation at the scheme stage, and that this and they are being turned into often a referendum. But if your original plan doesn't evidence that local people have informed it in some way, then that can really have a sort of a really negative impact on the kind of on
Can
its
I just
like
start
later iteration.
Maybe Ben goes in next, if that's all right. I think Brian uses this a lot as well, Ornstein's ladder, which is about, the sociologists here will know what that is. It's about a hierarchy of engagement. And there's consultation, which is what really happens in local plan with local routes, which is, here's something we like, do you like it or not? That's not engagement, and it's certainly not co-design, which is at the top of Ornstein's ladder. The problem with co-design is you need engaged people who really know what they're talking about. And if you don't do co-design with people who don't know what they're talking about, you just get the mess of what happens in some of the LTNs. So I think it's the right consultation, the right participation at the right stage. But it goes back to what Ben said, which is, if you see it as a process, as a living document, and you have a steering group which is there to start, to govern it, to keep it going, then representatives on that can keep going. If it's a permanent body and you bring more people in, take less people out, bring different experts in at the right stages, then it can then carry on. If you do it as what most authorities have done, not most, many, some don't really know, of let's produce a document. Hey, we produced a document. We've done the document. Big tick. Wait 5 years and do it again. If you do that, then yeah, you'll get this. And just one bête noire I want to throw in, and this is a slight criticism of all of us, myself, all of us campaigners. It's really easy to look at a road and say, I know what should be here, to jump straight from walking out, all our experiences of walking out saying this should be my experience tells me this should be a protected track or whatever, without thinking, is this the right place? Is that the right thing? What about everyone else? And I think the one mistake that the early ones made, and I'll include the ones I worked on, is to go into too much detail too early. You put the line and you say there should be something from here to there. You then put it into a pipeline. So I've come up with a new acronym while we were talking, which is looking closely at what's included in pipelines. And it is really just a thing of saying this should be the next thing. You pass this on to the next stage of funding, of bidding, and then your consultants design the detail, and then you go into the consultation. What you're establishing is the strategic need to do something, not designing in detail at this stage. And a lot of the time has been spent on that detail. I worked on Crawley in detail in 2019, and none of it's been done. Now we're doing it again. So all that work, great, I got paid for it, but it needn't have been done at the level of detail it was done at the time.
I think just to add to what Mark said, I think in my mind it's just a bit of a mismatch of like a design scheme or something like on the ground will be open to like intense scrutiny, and yet an LCWIP is covering a whole authority potentially, and there's there might not be any engagement. I think it probably isn't unique to LCWIPs. I think a lot of it will come down to actually the propensity of that authority to engage or consult day to day anyway. I don't think it's very limited to their appetite for LCWIPs. I think it's almost you need to have been an authority that's seen the benefit of doing it to realise it's work. Like in Wantage, for example, working on that marketplace project now, having had the LCWIP identify the marketplace as the single most contentious or biggest issue in Wantage, makes that quite seamless, that narrative in terms of where this has come from as a project. As opposed to, I remember there was a project last year in North Kent where we were consulting on a new kind of quite a high quality cycle track north of Sevenoaks, which was cited in the LCWIP, but the LCWIP had never left the council offices. So the first reaction of people at public consultation was, well, you're assuming I signed up to the LCWIP and that I liked the LCWIP. And because the council had skipped that step, it just, the moment I realised it hadn't been publicly kind of shared, it just, your heart sank a bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's issues around taking ownership. The Newcastle's first LCWIP was, in fact, for sort of the first iteration of it, was developed at a Newcastle cycle campaign meeting, and John Dales came and facilitated that from Urban Movement. And that, that I think and obviously then, it was taken on and more work was done to develop it, but it means that the people and it was a big, 50 people meeting, it means that you've got, at least a lot of people who have got some kind of they're invested in supporting it, and you've got that kind of community support. I guess I'm going to ask more questions now, but I suppose one of the things I always wonder around this, particularly if you have a steering group, is how you make sure that is reflective of the whole of the wider population. Particularly I'm thinking about kind of children and young people. How do you make sure that this is kind of relevant for everybody and not the usual suspects? But it's really tricky, isn't it, that work? Right, I'm going to ask a question from the Q&A. Andy from Wiltshire says, here in Wiltshire, consultations on 5 LCWIPs have just closed. The geographic scope of them is very small, less than a square kilometre in some cases. In the case of my local LCWIP, Bradford upon Avon, which is very congested market town, the population of the surrounding villages exceeds the town centre, but the villages are excluded from the scope. The outcome is a handful of walking and cycling routes that will make no difference to the congestion. His question is, what's the point?
Well, yes. I mean, but that's Ben's stage 0, isn't it? The stage 0.
Or conversely, I was going to say it's a bit like Farnham, where actually, like, it might be that the LCWIP just wasn't the right time for that project. That was the thing in Farnham. Like, it was really like that LCWIP now should really be a breeze because they're getting the principles right in the town centre and address it. That we knew, well, on that project happened to have access to traffic data. That was telling us that in the region of like 45% of traffic. Actually, the brief at the beginning of that Farnham project from the local members was to make the car parking bays wider for the SUVs because they were overhanging into the carriageway, which obviously I didn't necessarily agree with that. Well, no, I didn't agree with it. But because we had the modelling data, it was very easy for us to kind of get back to that point about the town centre, and we could work out that 45% of that traffic in the town centre was through traffic, not bringing anything to the town centre. that position, that whole project much easier. And then the LCWIP follows on. And I think maybe that's the thing, stage 0 almost, not to go too far, but it's almost like you just stage -1 of like, do you even need an LCWIP right now? Or is it what project types might help with what you've got? Right. And the rule design guide, which ATE, working on when I was at PJ, we were kind of making a similar recommendation on that as well. As early on, it's just getting a sense of, well, what is the authority particularly good at the moment, or what are its historical banana skins, or what do you need to work with, rather than just going in with active travel as a silver bullet.
Yeah, I mean, it starts from the basis that you want to do a network. I mean, it's, the assumption is, well, first of all, it's the infrastructure side. Remember what I said about it's just a pipeline, a list, a plan of things to build, not why you should build them. So it starts from the assumption, as Ben said, that you want to do that, and it's going to be good, automatically good, without working out whether you as an authority or they as an authority actually are going to deliver it. So if the aim is to literally have a tick box to say, in order to get our ATE capability rating, we need to have an LCWIP, then they've done what it says on the tin. They've done it. It's got one. Fine. But if your outcome is to actually get more people walking, wheeling, and cycling, then it's just a means to that end. And you need to think, what is the means? Is that the best means? And back to the size, I mean, 1 square kilometer sounds tiny. I mean, really tiny. We did a very early one. I didn't even call it an LCWIP. And I remember Phil Jones saying, no, it's an LC. Don't call it a mini LCWIP. It's an LCWIP for a town called Sawbridgeworth, which is halfway between Harlow and Bishop Stortford. A town of about, or village of about 8,000. So a big village, a small town. And I remember calling it mini. And they said, no, it's not mini. It's a thing. I've got no idea what the perils of being a consultant is unless I go back there or somebody from East Herts tells me it's been done. I very much suspect very little has been done. But it's perfectly valid to do a small settlement to just scale it up, because after a small settlement, you know where the bottlenecks are. And all you need to do is to say, these are the reasons why this is important. But conversely, there are also people who will will find it very easy to get in the way. So this whole buy-in stuff of trying to get it well established is really important. And it sounds, and what you said, Sally, about who are the people participating. I mean, it's very similar if you take it broader out. It's very similar to the process of developing local plans for everything, as in planning documents. They are there to encapsulate the future of an area for 15, 20 years. You'll find that hardly anyone comments on local plans. Yeah, I was trying to get Bright to get young people involved, because I said this is till 2040. Toddlers now will be adults when some of the things mentioned in here are going to be built. So it's really important, maybe not toddlers, but maybe even primary school children, to get them engaged in seeing this. And the council, to their credit, actually did go out and do it. But you need to do it through a sort of rep structure, and the reps need to, reps need to be mindful of going back to the people that appointed them, elected them, and not just seeing it as, I'm elected, I can do what I like, and continually looking, both ways, feeding in, but getting the people that put you there to give you ideas. And that's hard work. I know it because I'm one of them in Brighton. So.
Yeah, and as you've both kind of alluded to, I mean, it depends very much, doesn't it, on the authority and their experience, their expertise, and so on. And yeah, there's very much different in different places. I'm going to bring in Ruth. She's put a question in the Q&A, but you've got your hand up, Ruth. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Okay, so, well, my question was, why can we not just do the Crow manual, which I know I've disagreed with Brian Deegan on, but one of the key things in the Crow manual is continuous. And a lot of the cycling I do is across many different boroughs, councils, counties, even, and the problem is no continuity. And in terms of consultation, so the cycle lanes over the Maidenhead smart bridges, either side of those, one of them is part of Route 4, but either side of them, you're on a very dangerous road, then you get on it and you go over, and there's a beautiful cycle lane over it. And the minute you come off it, it disappears into an overgrown path. Footfall is negligible there because it's too far from anywhere. So my question really is, why is it that we still do not join up? And quickly to say about consultations, Hounslow is actually really, really good, and they dismiss people who respond by saying, well, I don't like it, or it means I can't park there, or I can't drive there. But I hear, and Farnham, I used to go to a lot, the cafe owners were in despair about that scheme. They'd been asked and they said, no, this isn't going to work. And they've been proved right, I think. So, in some ways, we need to have the awful, the dreaded, those roads that go round villages that people don't like because of induced demand. But otherwise, we're going to end up with continually having traffic in small, pretty town centres like Marlow, which is an absolute disgrace. Anyway, so my question is, how do we join up the fact that we don't cycle in silos? We all cross from one place to another quite often, not on short journey trips, but on decent kind of cycling. And they all need to be joined up to make more people decide to leave the car at home. Rant over.
Well, there's an easy answer to that, which is it's in there. It's in there. I'm looking at the document when you get the slides. Where built-up areas, straddle authorities, cross-border liaison may be required. This guidance sets out potential delivery models. So in the guidance document, it actually says if you have, and by the way, I need to apologise to the Londoners here for going, what the hell is an LCWIP? Because of course you don't have one. But the same thing sort of applies, but it says if you've got contiguous urban areas, work together, form a joint board to work across the border. And councils I mean, that the problem is maybe it's changed now, but the problem is that the DFT at the time, I think there might have been one civil servant who'd ever worked for a local authority. So the DFT's attitude was very much, we tell councils what to do. We've never worked in a council. So they didn't realise that Council A won't talk to Council B, even if the Watford and Three Rivers, which are both Lib Dem controlled, actually that's a bad example because they're both in Hertfordshire, but you know what I mean. Even if they're the same council with the same part or same political structure, they're different councils. They have different councillors, different ideas, and they just won't talk to each other. So maybe regional mayors may make that better, but then you've got different issues with there. So it is about what is the area that you should be covering in the first place. And yes, that's the whole idea of continuity, was to agree something in there and then to say, we can't necessarily do all of it in one go, but we can certainly plan to do all of it, put it all together and have a plan to do it. The problem then is something happens 2 years down the line, and someone else comes in and says, oh, well, we've only got halfway through building this, and now we're not going to build the rest of it here. And I'm looking at Becky, and Becky is smiling because we know that's what's happened on the A23 route in Brighton, where it was in there as a route in the LCWIP, got half built, and then somebody else came in and said, actually, we won't build the rest of it. So that's a different thing about sticking to what you said you're going to do in the first place. But at least it was in there as a plan to build a continuous route. You can't build everything everywhere all at once, to borrow from a film, but at least you can plan everywhere all at once.
I think, Ruth, on your point about this traffic in the smaller town, but yeah, like Farnham was interesting because it's got the bypass, like it's got the A31 bypass. So like one of the first things we said was like, well, you've got, and actually a big surrounding road network. So it's almost like, like we're talking about a few, not even miles of road network in the town centre, in the perspective of this huge network you've got of A roads to accommodate that traffic. And I think it's funny to get, and this is my point about, maybe LCWIP's not being quite the right project, because I think I have worked on some where they've been seen potentially as a bit evangelical in that it's assuming that active travel will solve everything. And there's lots of places where we work where the elephant in the room is the role of traffic, the volumes of it, what is it doing? That it's just, but that actually, and Robin and I would, well, Robin in particular made this pitch last year to ATE, because this is the thing, is like there isn't an off-the-shelf project type for those kind of situations. Farnham was a really brilliant project actually, but it was kind of something we developed the brief together collaboratively with Surrey. It's not something like an LCWIP you can just go and get, and that is often, I think, the problems that if somebody tomorrow instigated the equivalent of like a low traffic town methodology or whatever equivalent it might be, I think that would get so much traction, because I think there are so many places that are otherwise, and that, that's where sometimes LCWIPs is the best alternative that people have got, because otherwise there isn't a way to challenge those points.
Yeah, just going back, actually, one of the things I was thinking about was governance. So we're working in Crawley, which is a district council. It's not the highway authority. So anything that we do for Crawley, with the best intentions, it then has to pass up to its next level up to actually implement. Whereas in Oxfordshire, if Oxfordshire's doing one for an area, then it can do it, but it's not the area. It doesn't just cover that area. So there is this real issue about partnership governance, which again, local government reorganisation may or may not do that. I mean, the evidence that, all of you who are in combined authority areas already will say, well, it hasn't quite worked out like that. But it will get rid of some of those things. That's even before you get into parish-led, which there are parish-led LCWIPs. I mean, there's one for Arundel, if you know Arundel, with a castle in it. There's a parish-led LCWIP done by the woman who was the officer at Crawley, and then she retired and became a parish councillor and wrote one for her own village. But it's 2 tiers down from the highway authority.
Yeah, it's all interesting though, thinking about what scale would work. I'm going to take another question from the Q&A and then I'll come to you, Adrian. Sally Bean Healthy Travel Survey says, why is there not more focus on travel to and from schools, do you think?
Schools are a destination within those destinations. I don't think there hasn't been. I think maybe certainly school streets, for example, wasn't a tool that was envisaged when it was started. But I think it's unfair to say there hasn't been. It's to do with what the council prioritises. So if, I said everyone can choose the prioritisation. So if a council doesn't prioritise school travel or youth travel, it won't get delivered. So it's why you could. The question is why don't some councils prioritise school travel themselves rather than why doesn't the LCWIP prioritise it? If it did, then it would do more. So it's a bigger question, like your point about youth consultation, than just the routes. So if you start off in the brief being told build stuff to workplaces, then the client wants you to look at stuff to workplaces.
Yeah.
Slightly passing the buck, I appreciate.
Ben, do you have anything to come in on that?
Yeah, well, I guess I agree with Mark. I wouldn't see it's the thing that's not done. I think it's probably just where it might be lost in the mix, maybe in the LCWIP methodology, as the routes and networks are developed, how it comes across. But I would never say it's. I think it actually, before you get to the prioritization, the way that we've got around it in the past is like it's almost like the weighting of the network and how you shape the network about what the routes are accommodating. Because it's quite easy for it to be concentric and take the local center and the routes radiate out from that, rather than actually having a bit of a hierarchy of what centers are you connecting to or what destinations. Yeah, I've never knowingly seen one that hasn't included. Maybe I take it for granted that it would be kind of a big factor.
I live in Elmbridge, and
okay.
There's nothing in schools. It's just between towns, basically.
Well,
I think the one thing, so just on, I guess, and probably Mark did allude to earlier, and you see, a bit flippant to say this as a consultant, what a big problem with the LCWIPs, and I think Kent had this when they were doing their county-wide LCWIP, was trying to reconcile the fact that the large majority of LCWIPs have been developed by consultants who each have their own style and outputs and methods, and so it isn't. So I know Elmbridge, and I think so I guess in the example of Elmbridge, it may well be that has just fallen out of like that area of interest, because I think there is unfortunately a bit of a spectrum associated with LCWIPs in terms of just who's done them as well, unfortunately.
Yeah, we're trying to obviously be polite to our colleagues in the industry, but there are obviously bigger and smaller and very small and people you'd never heard of who suddenly appear in a local area and happen to know the local councillor. I'm not suggesting that's corrupt, but they, that they win it that way. So there's a whole spectrum of LCWIPs, and I think one of the issues is some organizations do everything standard, and you could look at it and it's the same format with the same design, and others, even the ones we've done, Crawley badged it, so it's Crawley's that you'd hard pressed to see it was TI that did it. Whereas when we did Chichester's, it was our document for Chichester, so it had our logo on, and it was adopted. 2 councils very near each other. So, and some will just say we've got a term consultant, we'll use the term consultant because it's we have to use our term consultant because that's the contract we've got with them, and they may or may not be good at doing LCWIPs, and more particularly, They may or may not, the person who's good at them may be busy doing something else somewhere else and not have the time. So it does come back to this governance and brief thing.
Mm.
We did do, by the way, when we did one LCWIP, we did get somebody to do a study of what made a good LCWIP, and what the sort of characteristics that we'd look at. And I do remember that the feedback was that Robin will smile at this, that Oxford's was both the best and the worst LCWIP at the same time. It was the best because it was the most comprehensive and the most detailed, and we all know who we're talking about. The most level of detail, and it just went into every possible thing you could ever possibly think of, and therefore was, I think, 400 pages long, and nothing that anyone would ever read or actually read again, certainly read once. And therefore the politicians wouldn't look at page 400. They'd leave to page 2 or 3 and they go, God, this is too long. I can't be bothered with this. So it didn't have any impact. So the question is an LCWIP a document for what you should be building, or is it a document to persuade the public, or a bit of both? And obviously it's a bit of both. But if you do that, you have to realize that people want to see it. And then you've got LCWIPs that are just glossy pictures, a bit not unlike the one that Ruth mentioned, of just lots of glossy pictures being happy, pushing buggies and pushing wheelchairs with no detail at all, which everyone would say that's wonderful, and then nothing happens because it's just so vague.
Thank you, Mark. Right, we've got 5 minutes left and there's still lots of questions. So first of all, Adrian had his hand up, but he's put it down now. Adrian, do you have a question? Do you want to come in?
Well, I was just going to say that if anybody wants to come and look at Faversham or talk to me or Ben about what Faversham has done right and the challenges which are still faced, be very, very happy to do that. I would just like to reiterate that the political and governance support is the most important thing. The second most important thing is money. And when you look at what Faversham has managed to achieve, it's pretty good. It's $1.5 million, I think, has been spent in total, but it probably needs 100 million in a small town. And that's the scale of the challenge which we are facing. Unless the money is there, all the LCWIPs in the world are not going to help us. So that's really the challenge, the challenge which faces us. I think that Faversham has got a lot right. The document is continually being upgraded and updated. Also, it also interlinks with the neighbourhood plan and with the local plan. So and also, all the other people in the highway authority are viewing the LCWIP and Faversham, so that if there's developer money somewhere, then that is directed towards things which are in the LCWIP. So it's really, but it needs a huge amount of effort and work, and you can't do that without the political buy-in and the governance that Mark talked about.
Thanks, Adrian. Right, I'm going to I can see you got your hand up, but you put a few questions in the Q&A. So what I'm going to try and do, instead of come to you, because we have 3 minutes now, is to
I wanted to just ask one quick question, and I don't know how this can be not answered. Has anyone got any idea how many LCWIPs there are?
This was actually one of the questions, Mark. So shall I go over these questions and then you can give us your final thoughts? One of the questions that I have is, how many LCWIPs are they? Who is producing the best ones? Wilf suggests, and then there are a few suggestions. Wilf says, do we need them all to be put into a super cyclescape for the whole country? And then I'm also going to pick out a couple of other comments, just I think it's worth floating. Beth from Torbay says our LCWIP for Torbay, very little delivery 5 years on, has been based partially on Strava heat maps. Clearly a bad thing to do, as it only gives routes currently travelled, and also, as we know, is kind of biased towards certain parts of the population. And then another final comment, Caroline from Bedford, message for the presenters rather than a question. I find LCWIPs really useful in my work producing WCHA, walking, cycling and horse riding assessments on national highway schemes. So that's kind of quite an interesting one. But yeah, I think any kind of thoughts about where are the best ones? What do we know about kind of the
I
coverage?
said where the best one was, which was Oxford, and the worst one. I don't know, and we don't know whether ATE what level of investigation ATE is doing to them at the moment. It'd be interesting if they were willing to tell us, but I think was it Will said about crowdsourcing, and I think what would be good if Adam was here. Adam's got a list of all the local authorities in the country, hasn't he? Adam Reynolds. What we good, have you got it, Robin, as well, is if we put that up as a Google Doc and got everyone to fill in the ones that they know of in their area, and crowdsourced it. Because I confess, I don't use AI very much, but I did use both ChatGPT and Gemini to try and find out how many there were. ChatGPT gave me a completely bollocks answer, sorry for swearing, but it was just hallucinating stuff and it was rubbish. Gemini was actually much more to the point, and it said, and I got, it's a believable figure that there is between 220 and 240. And over 90% of authorities have at least one. And that's for someone like Oxfordshire, which might have 3, 4, 5, I don't know how many. West Sussex has probably half a dozen because it has one for each district and one for the whole county. But some councils are joint. So it's just really weird. It's very hard to say, literally, this is a discrete LCWIP and that's a discrete LCWIP and so on. So it needs everyone at the local area to fill them in and to say how many they are. National parks have their own LCWIP, which straddles borders and so on as well. So Northumberland has one, I'm sure.
Sounds like a really good bit of crowdsourcing.
So if somebody's willing to do that, we could all start filling them in. I'm happy to sort of work with Robin and just set up a schema of what you should put in there. And one of the reasons, by the way, that ChatGPT said it couldn't do it is that not all of them are obviously available on their council's websites. They're not just can't just go to Council X and search LCWIP, because some of them will be committee reports. So you've got to find it at the committee when it was passed, and it's an appendix to that committee, and it's not actually in a searchable format. Other than that, some of them will be on a website. Some of them will be easy to look. Some of them will have maps. Some of them won't. So every council does it differently.
Yeah.
And if they did it the same, Ben, I'm going to let Ben have the last word.
Let Ben have a final word, and then I will want to wrap up.
I don't know what to add, Mark. That was quite a lot, Mark. I think I would say, and not as a slippery answer, I think the quality of the LCWIPs and who's doing them well. I think in Mark's search, he found which consultants are doing more of them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's a reflection of the lay of the land. I think as much as it's down to who's doing the LCWIP, it's the brief as well, because you have got some authorities that are literally just doing lip service to the methodology, and it is the LCWIP reflects that. Whilst there are those like the Oxfordshire examples or maybe Essex that, from my experience, are a bit more imaginative with their scopes and flexible with actually what they're doing with them. So I think as much as it is the quality of the final LCWIP, it might have been already determined at the scope and at that first stage of what was set out.
Yeah, and well, it'd be interesting. It'd be interesting to know, how many there are and where they are, and also what might happen next.
Well, and I think one of the things is the dates of those as well, because I think the point I made about refreshing that is it would be interesting, because the thing is there is now more demand for updating and refreshing LCWIPs, so that is going to be coming up more actually. That and so you might have had a bad document 10 years ago. Are you now going to go and reinvent it, or are you just going to try and hash together what you've already got? And Robin, I see your hand.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we probably could say what a good LCWIP is now, and the first ones were not so good because, and the Oxford one I would class as not so good just because it was one of the first, and we can now say it needs to have a clear picture of those continuous networks that Ruth described. What are the clear prioritization? So then the next things you would do if you got some extra money, and enough engagement along the process and data along the process so that it's robust. There are probably some other things, but those are the things I could think of.
And I think
Oxfordshire's got 13 now, and the 14th is headed for approval.
Wow.
And they definitely took about three of them to get into a groove, and then since then most of them have been good, but they've been a bit variable. But I'll shut up because we're
Right, we have to wrap up. We are done. We're 3 minutes over now, but thank you so much, Ben and Mark. That was really, really fantastic. I do hope this is the beginning of a crowdsourced research project that will look into LCWIPs, and whoever takes that on can come back and share that with us. We're taking a break now for a couple of weeks. We'll be back on the 21st of April. We have Deborah Williman, Manchester, talking about Manchester's first camera-enforced school street in Oldham. So do join us for that. And I hope you all have a good break.
Can I just say to my Jewish friends here, as well as me, hope you have a good Seder night tomorrow night, and happy Easter for those who are going to church.
Thank
Hag
you, Mark.
Sameach.
Yeah.
Chag Sameach, yes.
Hag Sameach.
Fantastic. Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
Mark.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.